What happens when a prejudiced woman refuses to sit beside a black man, confident no one will challenge her? This is the gripping account of a flight turned into a standoff against discrimination. From an onboard confrontation to a decisive courtroom reckoning, see how justice prevails and resilience overcomes hate. The cabin of the Sun Air Flight 227 hummed softly with the rhythmic drone of air circulation, mingling with the subdued murmurs of passengers settling into their seats. Anthony adjusted the strap on his laptop bag, tucking it neatly beneath the seat in front of him. Positioned by the window, he savored the quiet before the flight. A well-worn book lay open on the tray table before him, its pages detailing strategies for entrepreneurial growth. This was just another business trip for him, predictable and purposeful, the kind he found both productive and comforting. Eliza, a woman with a pinched expression and a carry-on suitcase gripped tightly in her hand, entered the cabin. Her eyes flitted from one row number to the next, her demeanor one of someone accustomed to getting her way. She exuded an air of entitlement, a person used to controlling her environment in small but meaningful ways. When she reached her assigned seat, her expression froze. Anthony glanced up briefly, offering a polite nod before returning his attention to his book. Eliza, however, seemed unable to mask her disapproval. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the cabin noise. "There's clearly been a mistake." A passing flight attendant paused, her professional smile unwavering. "Can I assist you, ma'am?" Eliza gestured stiffly toward Anthony without meeting his eyes. "I need to switch seats. I don't think I should be sitting here." The flight attendant consulted her seating chart. "This is your assigned seat. Is there an issue?" Eliza hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just think this arrangement isn't going to work for me," she said, her tone measured yet loaded. Anthony, catching the unspoken meaning behind her words, felt a pang of discomfort. He kept his eyes trained on his book, refusing to engage. The flight attendant, maintaining her calm, replied, "I'm afraid the flight is fully booked. Please take your seat so we can prepare for takeoff." Eliza's face hardened, her frustration palpable. With a dramatic huff, she wedged herself into the middle seat. Though the cabin filled with ambient chatter, her muttered complaints carried just enough to reach Anthony's ears. Ridiculous. Uncomfortable. The cabin door closed with a mechanical hiss, and the flight attendant's voice announced the imminent departure. Anthony exhaled slowly, hoping the tension might dissipate. But as the plane ascended, it became clear this was just the beginning. Once airborne, the seatbelt sign flicked off, and passengers began adjusting themselves in their seats. Anthony resumed reading, his focus strained under the mounting tension beside him. Eliza shifted repeatedly, her exaggerated movements brushing her elbow against his arm. She opened and closed her tray table with unnecessary force, letting out audible sighs. "You'd think people would have the decency to switch seats when they know someone's uncomfortable," she muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Her tone was less an observation and more a declaration. Anthony closed his book and turned to face her, his voice calm yet firm. "Is there something you'd like to say to me?" Eliza blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "I'm just saying some people don't consider how their presence might make others uneasy." She leaned toward the aisle, as if trying to distance herself further. A man across the aisle glanced over, his expression one of mild disbelief. Anthony let her words hang in the air before responding evenly. "If you're uncomfortable, that's your issue, not mine." Eliza's eyes narrowed. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath. She flagged down the same flight attendant from earlier. "I need to change seats," she demanded, her tone sharper now. The flight attendant approached with a calm, practiced air. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I mentioned earlier, we're fully booked. All passengers must remain in their assigned seats." Eliza crossed her arms tightly, her indignation building. "It's not safe for me to sit here. I don't know this man, and he's making me feel threatened." Her words landed heavily, drawing quiet murmurs from the surrounding passengers. The flight attendant's expression tightened but remained professional. "Ma'am," she said firmly, "this gentleman has not done anything wrong. Please remain seated and refrain from making further remarks." Eliza's face reddened. "So I'm just supposed to sit here and feel unsafe? Is that what you're saying?" Anthony, his voice steady but edged with frustration, finally spoke up. Exactly what about me sitting here reading a book is unsafe? Her silence was telling, but the simmering tension promised the situation was far from resolved. Sitting calmly, reading his book, Anthony spoke up, his voice calm but commanding enough to pierce the tension. Exactly what is unsafe about me reading here? Eliza turned toward him, her irritation boiling over. You're invading my personal space for one thing. And frankly, I don't feel comfortable sitting this close to someone I don't trust. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. A passenger 2 rows back called out, Lady, he's just sitting there. You're the one making a scene. Eliza whipped her head around, glaring daggers at the man who had dared to intervene. Mind your own business, she snapped, before turning back to the flight attendant. I'm not the problem here, I'm just expressing my concerns. The flight attendant sighed, her patience visibly thinning. Ma'am, this is your assigned seat. If you continue to disrupt the flight and other passengers, I'll have to report this. Eliza's voice climbed in pitch, filled with righteous indignation. Report me? For standing up for myself? This is harassment, plain and simple. I'm being forced to sit here when I feel unsafe. She gestured wildly, her words growing louder. A young woman seated in front turned around, her expression unimpressed. He hasn't even spoken to you until now. You're the one making this uncomfortable for everyone else. Eliza's mouth opened as if to retort, but no words came out. Her face flushed a deeper shade of red as she scanned the surrounding passengers. The tide was clearly turning against her. You all have no idea what it's like to feel unsafe, she muttered, crossing her arms and turning toward the aisle in defiance. Anthony leaned back slightly, his expression calm but unreadable. You're right, he said softly. I don't know what it's like to feel unsafe sitting next to someone minding their own business. A ripple of laughter and murmured agreement swept through the cabin. Eliza shot him a venomous glare, but it was clear her audience had shifted their support. She huffed and muttered under her breath, her arms still crossed tightly. The flight attendant glanced at Anthony with an apologetic expression before stepping away, clearly deciding not to escalate the situation for now. Anthony sighed, reopening his book, though his thoughts were now anything but calm. He had encountered prejudice before, but something about Eliza's unrelenting hostility gnawed at him. He could feel the tension hanging thick in the air. Minutes passed, but the atmosphere in row 15 remained taut. Eliza continued shifting in her seat, ensuring her arm brushed against Anthony with every exaggerated movement. She stayed quiet this time, but her simmering frustration was palpable. The plane cruised steadily at altitude, but the unease in the row didn't dissipate. Anthony gazed out the window, trying to lose himself in the peaceful expanse of clouds. Eliza, however, was far from tranquil. Her rigid posture and muttered complaints hinted at a storm brewing within. This is just so typical, Eliza said loudly, ensuring her voice carried above the cabin hum. I don't know why they let situations like this happen. Anthony turned his head slightly, his expression calm but questioning. Situations like what? Eliza met his gaze briefly before looking away, her voice dripping with disdain. Like forcing people into uncomfortable situations. I paid for this seat expecting a pleasant flight, not to be crammed into this mess. Anthony closed his book, folding his hands in his lap. Are you uncomfortable because of me? Eliza scoffed. I'm just saying it's not fair to put people in positions where they don't feel safe. Not everyone wants to be packed in like this next to strangers. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Strangers? Or someone like me? Her eyes darted to him and quickly away, her cheeks darkening. Don't twist my words, you know what I mean. I don't, actually, Anthony replied evenly. Why don't you explain? Eliza hesitated, her lips pressed into a thin line. Finally she muttered, people like you don't respect others' personal space, it's always something. Anthony tilted his head, his voice calm but edged with purpose. People like me? What exactly do you mean by that? Eliza let out a dramatic sigh, her frustration boiling over. I don't have to explain myself to you. It's not my fault I don't feel comfortable. A man across the aisle turned to her, his expression incredulous. Lady, he's just sitting there. You're the one making everyone else uncomfortable. Charlotte snapped her head toward him. Mind your own business, she barked before turning back to Anthony. It's not personal. I just think it's wrong to cram everyone together like this, especially when you don't know who you're sitting next to. Anthony leaned back slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. So you're saying you're uncomfortable because of me, but it's not personal? Eliza bristled, her voice rising defensively. Look, I don't know what you're used to, but I'm not the type to pretend everything's fine just to be polite. Anthony's reply was quiet but firm. Clearly. Eliza glared at him, her indignation palpable as murmurs of disapproval from other passengers surrounded her. Eliza's face flushed a deep red as her frustration boiled over. You think you're so clever, don't you? Always making everything about race, she snapped. The words hit the air like a slap, drawing audible gasps from nearby passengers. Anthony stiffened slightly, but kept his composure intact. I didn't bring up race, he said, his voice low and firm. But now that you have, let me ask you something. What exactly about me is making you uncomfortable? Eliza faltered, her gaze darting to the flight attendant walking down the aisle. I shouldn't have to explain myself to you, she muttered, her voice unsteady. It's just, some people have a way of making others uneasy. Uneasy? Anthony repeated, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmurs around them. You mean people who don't fit into the little box you've decided is acceptable? Eliza's mouth opened, but no words came out. Around them, passengers exchanged incredulous looks. A woman in the row ahead leaned over her seat and said loudly, Why don't you stop talking before you embarrass yourself even more? Eliza whipped her head toward the woman, her glare venomous. This isn't about you, she snapped before turning back to Anthony. You don't understand what it's like to feel unsafe. The absurdity of her statement made Anthony laugh softly, though there was no humor in it. Unsafe? Sitting next to a man reading a book? Do you even hear yourself? Eliza's face flushed even deeper. She gripped the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. I knew this would happen. You're trying to make me out to be the bad guy when I'm just being honest. You've made your feelings abundantly clear, Anthony replied, his voice calm but cutting. And I'll be honest with you. Your discomfort is your problem, not mine. The flight attendant appeared then, her expression serious and her tone firm. Is there an issue here? Eliza wasted no time pointing at Anthony. He's harassing me. The flight attendant frowned, glancing at Anthony, who remained seated quietly. From what I've seen, ma'am, he's done nothing but sit in his assigned seat. You're the one causing the disturbance. Eliza gasped, her indignation clear. This is outrageous. I'm just expressing how I feel. The attendant straightened her posture, her patience clearly wearing thin. I need you to lower your voice and stop disturbing the passengers. This is your final warning. Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line as she leaned back into her seat, muttering under her breath. Anthony sighed deeply and reopened his book, though the tension in the air refused to dissipate. The confrontation had subsided for the moment, but he could still feel the weight of Eliza's hostility lingering. He braced himself. He knew this wasn't over. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as passengers settled into their routines, but row 15 was far from peaceful. Anthony stared out the window, trying to focus on the serene expanse of clouds below, but Eliza's simmering anger was almost tangible. Her muttered complaints grew louder, sharp enough to draw glances from those around them. This is exactly what's wrong with society today, Eliza said, her voice pitched to Carrie. Some people think they can do whatever they want and make everyone else uncomfortable. Anthony didn't respond immediately. He had heard this type of coded hostility before, and it had lost its ability to surprise him. Finally, he turned to her, his tone calm but firm. If you have something to say to me, just say it. Eliza's lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. Oh, don't play the victim. You're not special. I never said I was, Anthony replied, his voice steady. But you've been going on about this since you sat down. Maybe it's time to stop. Eliza's tone hardened, her frustration boiling over. It's not my fault, I don't feel safe. Maybe people like you should think about how your presence affects others. The cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers nearby turned their heads, the weight of her words sinking in. Anthony tightened his grip on his book, but kept his voice steady. People like me? He asked, the edge in his tone. Eliza's jaw tightened, her voice trembling with fury as she spat. You think you're so clever, don't you? Always making it about things that aren't true. The accusation hung in the air like a slap, drawing gasps from the passengers. Anthony, still seated, maintained his composure but felt the weight of her words. "I haven't made anything about anything," Anthony replied, his voice calm but firm. "But since you've brought it up, tell me, what exactly about me is making you uncomfortable?" Eliza's eyes darted toward the aisle, searching for support. Spotting the flight attendant, her voice faltered. "I shouldn't have to explain myself," she muttered, her tone uneven. "Some people just make others uneasy." "Uneasy?" Anthony echoed, his tone cutting through the murmur of the cabin. "You mean people who don't fit into whatever ideas you've decided are acceptable?" Eliza's mouth opened, then closed, her confidence wavering. Around them, passengers exchanged whispers and incredulous looks. A woman 2 rows up leaned over her seat and said loudly, "Ladies, stop embarrassing yourself." Eliza whipped her head toward the woman, her glare sharp. "This has nothing to do with you," she snapped. She turned back to Anthony, her voice sharp. "You don't understand what it's like to feel unsafe." Anthony let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Unsafe? Sitting next to a man quietly reading? Do you hear yourself?" Eliza's face darkened as her fingers dug into the armrests. "I knew you'd twist this around. I'm not the bad guy here. I'm just being honest." "You've made yourself clear," Anthony said evenly, his gaze steady. "And I'll be honest too. Your discomfort is your problem, not mine." The flight attendant returned, her expression firm as she assessed the growing disturbance. "Is there a problem here?" she asked. Eliza shot to her feet, pointing an accusatory finger at Anthony. "He's harassing me." The flight attendant frowned, glancing at Anthony, who remained calm in his seat. "From what I've observed, ma'am, he's done nothing wrong. You, however, are creating a disturbance." Eliza gasped, her indignation palpable. "This is outrageous. I'm just trying to express my concerns." The attendant's voice grew sharper. "Ma'am, you need to sit down and lower your voice immediately. This is your final warning." Eliza's lips pressed into a thin line, but instead of complying, she squared her shoulders, defiance radiating from her stance. "I have every right to stand up for myself against this kind of behavior," she shouted, her voice rising above the steady hum of the engines. Passengers leaned into the aisles, whispering among themselves, their expressions ranging from disbelief to annoyance. A middle-aged man seated nearby shook his head and muttered to his companion, "This is ridiculous." The flight attendant's patience was clearly running thin. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down now. You're disturbing the other passengers." Eliza turned to the attendant, her hands trembling with frustration. "Disturbing? I'm protecting myself. This man," she pointed again at Anthony, "has been intimidating me since I sat down." Anthony finally spoke, his tone steady and composed. "Intimidating you? By sitting here? All I've done is exist in this seat. You've been hostile since the moment you arrived." Eliza's face twisted in indignation. "Don't you dare try to turn this on me," she shrieked. "You're manipulating the situation." At that moment, a young woman in the row behind Anthony stood. Dressed casually, her voice carried authority and disdain. "Lady, we've all been sitting here watching you lose it over nothing. No one's buying your act. Sit down already." Eliza spun to face the woman, venom dripping from her words. "Oh, of course, you'd side with him. People like you are all the same, always jumping to conclusions without knowing the full story." The young woman's eyes widened. "Are you serious right now? You're doubling down on this nonsense?" Eliza ignored her, waving frantically at the flight attendant. "I demand to speak to someone in charge. This is outrageous. He's dangerous, and no one is listening to me." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, frustration building. A man across the aisle leaned toward her, his voice sharp. "The only thing dangerous here is your attitude. Sit down before you're thrown off this flight." Eliza's face turned crimson. "You have no idea what I've been through," she shouted. The flight attendant stepped forward, her patience completely worn. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one final warning. Sit down now, or I will be forced to escalate this further." Eliza scoffed, her indignation bubbling over. "Escalate? Go ahead. I'd love to see how you explain letting someone like him make me feel unsafe." Anthony shook his head, exhaling slowly. "You're just digging yourself deeper." Eliza snapped back, her words dripping with venom. "Don't act like some saint. You've been antagonizing me this whole time with your smug attitude." Passengers exchanged exasperated glances, a collective disbelief settling over the cabin. Still, Eliza refused to back down, standing firm as the tension in the air reached its breaking point. A middle-aged man a few rows ahead rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the tense cabin. "Look, this guy's done nothing but sit there and read his book. She's the one causing all the trouble. We've all seen it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the passengers. Eliza's eyes darted around, her anger momentarily replaced by the flicker of fear. The reality of her isolation began to sink in, but instead of retreating, she doubled down. Clenching her fists, she took a step closer to Anthony, her voice rising again. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat, trembling with rage. "People like you always think you can push the limits and get away with it." Anthony raised his hands, palms open, in a gesture of calm. "I'm not pushing anything. You're the one making a scene." Eliza took another step forward, her gestures wild and erratic. "Oh, you'd love to paint me as the villain, wouldn't you? That's what people like you always do. Turn it around. Play the victim." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The blatant prejudice in her words sent a shockwave of disbelief among the passengers. A young man sitting nearby, phone in hand, began recording. "Yep," he said loudly. "You're definitely going viral for this. Keep going." Eliza's face twisted with fury as she lunged toward him, her arm outstretched. "Turn that off. You have no right to film me." The man leaned back, holding his phone just out of her reach. "I have every right to film a public meltdown. Go on, you're making my day." The flight attendant quickly stepped between them, her voice firm and commanding. "Ma'am, sit down. Now. This is your final warning." Eliza froze, her chest heaving as she glanced around the cabin. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for someone to support her, but the passengers' expressions were unified, a mix of frustration, disbelief, and disdain. "You're all against me," she muttered, her voice trembling with anger. "This is exactly what's wrong with the world. No one listens to the truth anymore." The flight attendant pointed to her seat, her tone firm and unyielding. "Ma'am, sit down now." But Eliza didn't move. Her body remained rigid, her defiance clear. Anthony exhaled deeply, his gaze steady as he looked at her. He had no desire for this fight, but he wouldn't shy away from it either. The tension in row 15 had reached a boiling point. Eliza stood trembling with fury, her fists clenched, her face red with anger. Her voice, sharp and shrill, rose above the hum of the engines. "This is exactly why people like you shouldn't be allowed to fly with the rest of us," she shouted, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You're all the same, loud, entitled, and always looking for trouble." Anthony remained seated, his body tense but composed. "I've done nothing but sit here and read a book," he said, his voice calm and firm. "You're the one making this an issue." Eliza's eyes widened with feigned disbelief. "Oh, please," she scoffed. "Don't play innocent with me. You've been sitting there looking smug, acting like you're better than everyone else. People like you always think the rules don't apply to you." A collective gasp rippled through the passengers. The murmurs of disbelief grew louder, but Eliza seemed oblivious. She took another step closer to Anthony, her finger now inches from his face. "You're nothing but trouble," she hissed, her voice dripping with contempt. "Every time someone like you shows up, there's a problem. Always demanding respect you haven't earned. Always expecting handouts." Anthony's jaw tightened as he looked up at her, his voice quiet but firm. "If anyone here is being disrespectful, it's you. You're out of control, and you're embarrassing yourself." "Embarrassing myself?" Eliza's face twisted in fury. "You don't belong here. People like you should stick to where you came from." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. A passenger several rows back muttered, "What the hell is wrong with her?" Eliza ignored the rising outrage around her. "You think you can sit there and act like you're better than me? Like you're my equal? You're not. You never will be." Anthony exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the armrests. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through her tirade. "You've made it clear what kind of person you are. Now sit down." But Eliza didn't sit. Her fury boiled over. In a sudden, wild motion, she lunged at Anthony, her hands clawing at his shirt. "You don't deserve to be here," she screamed. Chaos erupted in the cabin. "Hey, stop her!" someone yelled as Eliza grabbed at Anthony's arm, trying to pull him forward. Anthony leaned back, raising his arms defensively. "Get off me," he said firmly. The flight attendant rushed toward them, her voice urgent. "Ma'am, stop immediately." Eliza thrashed, her nails raking across Anthony's arm as the cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers jumped from their seats to intervene, their voices rising in a chorus of shock and outrage. "You think you can intimidate me? You people are all the same. Nothing but trouble." Eliza screamed, her voice laced with venom. Two passengers sprang into action. The young man who had been filming earlier reached for Eliza's arm, pulling her back. "That's enough!" he shouted. "You're out of control." Another man from across the aisle stepped in, gripping her other arm to help restrain her. Eliza struggled violently against their grip, her voice escalating to a frantic scream. "Let me go. This is assault. I'm the victim here." The flight attendant, now visibly shaken but resolute, stepped between them. "Ma'am, you need to stop this immediately. You're endangering the passengers and the crew." Eliza twisted against the restraint, her voice rising to a piercing wail. "This is discrimination. I'm being attacked for standing up for myself." A woman nearby scoffed loudly. "Standing up for yourself? You just attacked him. You're out of your mind." Eliza's eyes darted around wildly, searching for an ally, but all she found were disapproving stares. "You're all against me because I dared to speak the truth," she shrieked. "This is what happens when you let people like him into spaces they don't belong." The murmurs of disbelief turned into open condemnation. "Get her off this plane," someone yelled. The flight attendant, her composure steady, signaled to a crew member. Moments later, they returned with zip ties in hand. "We need to restrain her until we land," the attendant said firmly. Eliza's thrashing became more frantic as the zip ties were applied to her wrists. "You can't do this. This is illegal. You're all going to regret this," she screamed. The passengers who had intervened forced her back into her seat. Eliza, now restrained, glared at Anthony with venomous eyes. Her voice was low but filled with malice. "You think you've won? You think this is over? You'll pay for this. People like you always do." Anthony shook his head slowly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "The only person paying for anything here is you." The flight attendant leaned down toward Anthony, her tone filled with regret. "Sir, I'm so sorry for what you've endured. Law enforcement has been notified and will handle her when we land." Anthony nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Eliza slumped back into her seat, her muttering continuing under her breath. Around her, passengers shook their heads in disgust or glared at her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Anthony turned back toward the window, staring out at the endless clouds. The storm inside the cabin had subsided for now, but he knew the fallout was far from over. The atmosphere in the cabin buzzed with nervous energy as passengers exchanged whispers and glances. Though Eliza was now restrained, her rage hadn't subsided. Her face remained flushed, her wrists trembling against the restraints in her lap. The tension was palpable. Anthony tried to steady his breathing, his gaze fixed out the window. He longed for peace, but Eliza's voice broke the fragile silence. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" she hissed, glaring at him. "Sitting there, acting like the victim, when you're the one causing all this trouble." Anthony turned his head slowly, his patience wearing thin. "You attacked me," he said, his voice sharp. "And now you're trying to play the victim? Unbelievable." Eliza leaned forward as much as her restraints allowed, her voice rising again. "Don't you dare lecture me. You people think you can just walk around demanding respect without earning it. I've worked hard for everything I have, unlike you." The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Passengers shook their heads in disbelief, with one man muttering, "Someone shut her up already." Anthony set his book aside and turned to face her fully. "I've worked hard for everything I have too," he said, his voice louder now, cutting through the cabin. "And I'm not going to sit here and let you insult me because you can't handle being called out." Eliza's eyes blazed with fury. "Oh, spare me your speech. You think the world owes you something because of your sob story? Guess what? It doesn't." Anthony's composure finally broke. He raised his voice, his words slicing through the chaos. "The world doesn't owe me anything, but it sure as hell doesn't owe you the right to treat me like I don't belong here. Your entitlement is disgusting." Passengers leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the confrontation. Some murmured their support for Anthony, while others called out for the crew to intervene. Eliza, undeterred, pushed harder. "Disgusting. That's rich coming from you," she screamed. "You don't even deserve to be on this plane. You're lucky they even let you on board." Anthony's voice rose to match her intensity. "Let me on board? I paid for this seat just like everyone else. You're the only one who seems to think you're above the rules." The flight attendant appeared again, her face pale but determined. "That's enough," she shouted, stepping between them. "Both of you need to stop yelling. This is a safety issue now." Anthony leaned back in his seat, exhaling sharply. Eliza, however, ignored the attendant's warning, straining against her zip ties as she continued to rant. "He's the problem here. He's the one making everyone uncomfortable. I wouldn't have said anything if he hadn't made me feel unsafe. He's been provoking me from the start." Eliza shouted, her voice rising in desperation. Anthony leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but resolute. "You felt unsafe because I exist? That's on you, not me." The flight attendant raised her hands to restore order, her tone turning firm. "Ma'am, you've left us no choice. We're moving you to the back of the plane until we land." Eliza's face contorted in disbelief. "You can't do that. I paid for this seat. You can't shove me to the back like I'm some kind of criminal." "You attacked another passenger," the attendant said coldly, her voice authoritative. "This is non-negotiable." Eliza's protests grew louder, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "This is a violation of my rights. He's the one who started it. I demand to stay here." Passengers stirred uncomfortably in their seats. Some shouted, "Get her out of here," while others clapped sarcastically. 2 additional crew members arrived, their expressions set with determination. Without hesitation, they unfastened Eliza's seatbelt and helped her to her feet. She squirmed and shouted as they guided her down the aisle, her feet dragging. "You're all going to regret this," she yelled, her voice echoing through the cabin. "I'll have your jobs, every single one of you." As she was escorted to the rear of the plane, passengers erupted into applause. A young woman sitting near Anthony turned to him and said, "About time they got rid of her." Anthony offered a tight smile but didn't respond. His hands gripped the armrests tightly, his adrenaline still pumping. In the back of the plane, Eliza was secured in a seat. Her tirade continued unabated. "This isn't over. You'll see. I'm not the bad guy here," she yelled at anyone within earshot. Back in row 15, Anthony took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His heart was still racing. He turned to the window, seeking solace in the endless stretch of sky outside. A man across the aisle leaned over and said, "You handled that better than I would have. She's completely unhinged." Anthony nodded, but didn't respond. Inside, he replayed the confrontation, the weight of Eliza's words heavier than he cared to admit. The anger, the humiliation, it was all too familiar. For now, the cabin had calmed, but the echoes of the argument lingered. Anthony knew the fallout wasn't over yet. The plane began its descent smoothly, but the tension in the cabin remained thick. Anthony sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the clouds outside. The cockpit announcement of their impending landing was met with a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. Many exchanged weary glances, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. At the back of the plane, Eliza's muttering had grown louder, breaking into sporadic bursts of shouting. Her bound hands wriggled against the restraints as her wild eyes darted around the cabin. "This is illegal. You can't treat me like this," she bellowed. Passengers near the rear winced at the shrill sound, a few groaning audibly. "Is she ever going to shut up?" one man muttered, shaking his head. Anthony could faintly hear her voice from his seat, but he tuned it out, his shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. Moments earlier, the flight attendant had quietly reassured him that security had been alerted and would handle the situation upon arrival. The plane touched down with a soft thud, and a ripple of relief passed through the cabin. However, unlike a typical landing, no one moved to unbuckle their seatbelts. The tension remained, everyone waiting for the resolution of the situation at the back. As the plane taxied to the gate, 2 uniformed security officers boarded swiftly. Their authoritative presence filled the aisle as they moved toward the rear, their expressions professional but firm. Eliza's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What are they doing here?" she shrieked, her piercing voice cutting through the quiet. She yanked against her restraints, her movements frantic and jerky. "I didn't do anything wrong." Why are you targeting me? She demanded, her eyes wide with indignation. The lead officer approached her calmly but firmly. Ma'am, we need you to remain seated and cooperate. You've been reported for causing a disturbance and assaulting another passenger. Eliza's face twisted in disbelief. This is a joke, right? I'm the victim here. She craned her neck to glare toward Anthony. That man provoked me. He started all of this. Anthony remained seated, his face impassive, refusing to engage. The flight attendant stepped forward, addressing the officers. She's been disruptive since the beginning of the flight and physically attacked another passenger. We had to restrain her for everyone's safety. Eliza's protests escalated. I'm the victim here. This is all his fault. You're all against me. The officers didn't waver, calmly preparing to remove her from the plane. As the tension reached its peak, passengers quietly watched, eager for the ordeal to end. Eliza's voice grew louder, her tone tinged with desperation. I'm not the problem. He is. Why are you listening to them? They're all lying. The officer didn't flinch, his voice firm but calm. Ma'am, we're going to escort you off the plane now. If you resist, additional charges will be filed. Eliza's voice cracked as she shouted, I'm not going anywhere. You can't make me. This is a setup. It's discrimination. Passengers murmured, some shaking their heads in disbelief, while others openly mocked her. Just get her off already, a woman muttered. We've had enough. Eliza's protests turned into frantic screams as the officers unfastened her restraints and helped her to her feet. She thrashed against their hold, her feet skidding against the floor. Get your hands off me. This is illegal. I'll sue every single one of you. The officers maintained their professionalism, their grips firm but not rough. Ma'am, calm down, one of them said. We're not going to hurt you, but you need to cooperate. Cooperate with this circus? Eliza screeched. You're ruining my life for no reason. As the officers began leading her down the aisle, she continued to resist, her shouts echoing through the cabin. Passengers leaned away as she passed, some rolled their eyes, others quietly recorded on their phones. I hope you all enjoy ruining an innocent person's life, she screamed. This isn't over. I'll make sure every single one of you pays for this. When Eliza passed Anthony's row, she twisted her neck to glare at him, her eyes burning with fury. This is your fault. You'll regret this. You people always ruin everything. Anthony met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. He didn't respond, letting her words hang in the air. The officers quickly ushered her toward the exit, her protests fading as she was let off the plane. Once Eliza was gone, the cabin collectively exhaled. A passenger sitting near Anthony muttered, Good riddance. That woman was out of her mind. The flight attendant approached Anthony, her voice quiet but kind. Sir, we're very sorry for what you went through. We've documented everything, and security will take it from here. She's in custody now. Anthony nodded, his voice steady but tired. Thank you. Passengers began murmuring among themselves, some offering Anthony words of support as they collected their belongings. While the ordeal was over, the weight of the confrontation lingered. As Anthony stood to gather his bag, he noticed the sympathetic looks and subtle nods from those around him. For now, Eliza was gone, but the repercussions of her actions were far from over. The plane finally emptied, the passengers filing out with a mix of relief and lingering frustration. Anthony waited quietly near the gate, his carry-on bag at his feet. He had been asked to stay for a brief discussion with airport security about the incident. The tension from the flight still sat heavily in his chest, though he kept a composed exterior. Across the terminal, Eliza stood flanked by two security officers. Her wrists were no longer bound, but her movements were restricted. Her voice, however, carried clearly across the space. This is an outrage, she bellowed. I've done nothing wrong, and now you're treating me like a criminal. This is harassment. One of the officers replied calmly but firmly. Ma'am, we've received statements from multiple passengers and crew members. Your behavior during the flight was unacceptable. You'll need to remain here for further questioning. Eliza's face flushed, her anger spilling over. Questioning? You should be questioning him. He's the one who started everything. This is a setup. Her voice grew louder as she noticed passengers from the flight watching the scene unfold. Some discreetly recorded with their phones, while others openly shook their heads in disbelief. Anthony watched from his seat, his expression unreadable. He wasn't interested in engaging with her any further. But the reality of the situation was clear. This wasn't just about the confrontation. It was about holding someone accountable for their actions. A flight attendant approached Anthony, her demeanor professional but empathetic. "Mr. Thompson," she began softly, "thank you for your patience. Security will handle everything from here, and the airline is fully cooperating. If you'd like, we can arrange for a car to take you home." Anthony nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, I just want this to be over." As the attendant walked away, another passenger approached, a young woman who had been seated nearby during the incident. She offered Anthony a small, sympathetic smile. "I just wanted to say," she said, "you handled that a lot better than I would have." That woman was completely out of line. Anthony gave a small nod. "Thanks," he said quietly, though his mind was still reeling from the confrontation. Across the terminal, Eliza continued her tirade. "You should all be ashamed of yourselves," she shouted at the officers. "I'm the victim here. This whole thing is a sham." The lead officer maintained his calm demeanor. "Ma'am, please remain seated and cooperate. This process will be smoother if you do." Eliza's voice rose again. "Cooperate? Why should I? You're treating me like a criminal while that man gets off scot-free." Nearby passengers exchanged disbelieving glances, some muttering quietly about the spectacle. Anthony remained in his seat, silent but resolute. As he waited for the ordeal to come to its conclusion, Eliza's voice carried as she continued her tirade. "You'll all regret this," she shouted at the officers. "I'll sue this airline, the flight crew, everyone. I've never been treated so badly in my entire life." A man who had been on the flight walked past, chuckling under his breath. "Lady, you did this to yourself," he muttered, shaking his head as he went. Eliza whipped around to face him, her expression furious. "Excuse me, how dare you?" she snapped. The officer beside her placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," he said evenly. "I am calm," Eliza retorted, though her trembling voice betrayed her anger. "But this whole thing is a sham. That man provoked me, and now I'm the one being punished? It's ridiculous." A security supervisor approached, clipboard in hand, his expression one of professional disapproval. "Ma'am," he said in a stern voice, "we've reviewed statements from the flight crew and multiple passengers. Based on the evidence, you will be temporarily detained for assault and disruptive behavior. Further legal action will depend on the outcome of our investigation." Eliza's jaw dropped. "Detained? Are you serious? For defending myself?" The supervisor's tone remained steady. "Assaulting another passenger and causing a disruption is not self-defense. You will have an opportunity to provide your side of the story, but for now, you need to cooperate." "This is unbelievable," Eliza shrieked, her voice breaking into a higher pitch. "I'm the victim here." Anthony watched the scene quietly from a distance, feeling a complicated mix of vindication and exhaustion. He had no interest in reveling in her downfall, but seeing her held accountable offered a small sense of closure. As the officers led Eliza toward a secure area, her protests echoed through the terminal. "You're all against me. This isn't over. I'll make sure every one of you pays for this." A nearby passenger muttered, "She's the only one paying here." Anthony allowed himself a faint smirk, but said nothing. The weight of the experience lingered as he picked up his bag and made his way toward the exit, his steps heavy but resolute. The ordeal had drained him, but he knew this was only the beginning of the fallout. The video of Eliza's meltdown spread across social media like wildfire. Recorded from multiple angles by passengers, clips of her racist remarks and physical attack on Anthony were uploaded before the plane even finished taxiing to the gate. Within hours, hashtags like Plain Eliza and Airborne Racism were trending. Eliza woke up the next morning to chaos. Her phone buzzed incessantly with calls, messages, and notifications. Groggy, she picked it up and squinted at the screen, only to see a flood of missed calls from her employer and texts from acquaintances. The first headline she saw stopped her cold. "Woman removed from flight after racist tirade goes viral." Her stomach churned as she scrolled through the article. It included snippets of the video, quotes from passengers condemning her behavior, and links to multiple viral posts. Her face was plastered everywhere. Mid-scream, mid-lunge, her anger immortalized for the world to see. No, 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 she whispered, her voice trembling as she frantically swiped through the comments. Each one felt like a dagger. She's disgusting. I can't believe people like this still exist. She should be arrested and fired. Eliza's heart raced as she opened her email, desperate to find something to salvage her spiraling situation. Instead, she was met with a curt message from her company's HR department. Subject: urgent, immediate suspension. Eliza Morton, due to the recent incident involving your behavior on a public flight which has been widely shared online, we are placing you on immediate suspension pending an internal review. Please do not report to the office until further notice. Regards, Human Resources. No, she whispered, her voice cracking. They can't do this to me. A call from an unknown number interrupted her panic. She hesitated before answering, her voice shaky. Hello? Eliza Morton? The voice on the other end was cold and professional. Yes, this is she, Eliza replied hesitantly. This is Officer Randall from the City Police Department. We've been informed of your behavior on Flight 842. You'll need to come down to the station for questioning regarding allegations of assault and disorderly conduct. Eliza's knees buckled. Assault? Disorderly conduct? Are you kidding me? That man provoked me. The officer's tone didn't waver. Ma'am, you were recorded physically attacking another passenger and disrupting the flight. You'll have an opportunity to explain yourself, but we strongly advise you to consult an attorney. Eliza's grip on her phone tightened as tears streamed down her face. This can't be happening, she whispered, staring at the wall in disbelief. The world she had carefully curated was crumbling, and there was no way to stop it. Eliza hung up the phone, her hands trembling as tears streamed down her face. She sank onto the couch, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like an anchor. Desperate to reclaim some semblance of control, she grabbed her laptop and logged onto social media. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing furiously. The post was long, a desperate attempt to paint herself as the victim. I am being unfairly targeted by cancel culture. These videos don't show the full story. I was provoked, manipulated, and left defenseless in a situation where I felt threatened. To anyone who knows me, you know I'm not a racist. This entire situation has been blown out of proportion. She hit post and leaned back, hoping for support. The backlash was immediate. You felt threatened by a man reading a book? Get real. Not a racist? The video says otherwise. Just apologize and disappear already. Eliza slammed the laptop shut, her breathing shallow. Nothing was working. The more she tried to defend herself, the worse things became. News outlets picked up her post, dissecting every word. Late-night talk shows mocked her mercilessly. Memes flooded social media, each one more cutting than the last. Her world was crumbling before her eyes. Friends stopped answering her calls. Family members distanced themselves, ashamed of her actions. Even her neighborhood became hostile. Neighbors whispered behind her back, and someone spray-painted racist on her front fence. Meanwhile, Anthony stayed quiet, as advised by his lawyer. He refrained from engaging with the media, but the support he received was overwhelming. Messages of solidarity poured in from strangers. Civil rights organizations offered to back him in pursuing legal action. His attorney filed a civil suit against Eliza, citing emotional distress, defamation, and assault. Eliza, already drowning in public scorn, now faced the prospect of financial ruin. This isn't fair, she whispered to herself one night, staring at the legal notice in her trembling hands. He's ruining my life. But deep down she knew the truth. She had ruined her own life. The holding cell was cold and uninviting. Eliza sat on the metallic bench, the chill of it seeping through her thin blouse. Her wrists ached from the restraints, and her hands fidgeted in her lap. The faint murmur of officers' voices and the occasional clink of keys grated on her already frazzled nerves. She had spent the night tossing and turning on the hard cot, replaying the events of the flight in her mind. "This is a nightmare," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "They can't treat me like this." An officer approached the cell, his expression neutral as he unlocked the door. Eliza straightened, her indignation bubbling just beneath the surface. "Finally, are you here to release me? This has gone on long enough." The officer ignored her tone. "You're being processed for questioning. Follow me." Eliza pressed her lips into a thin line as she stood, her heels clicking defiantly against the cold tile floor. Each step felt heavier with every passing second. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said, her voice rising as they moved through the station. "That man provoked me. I was defending myself." The officer remained silent, his stoic demeanor only fueling her frustration. "You're making a huge mistake," she snapped, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "I didn't do anything wrong." They entered a small, stark room where two officers sat behind a metal table. One gestured for her to sit. Eliza hesitated before complying, crossing her arms as she glared at them. "I hope you know I'm not answering any questions without my lawyer." The lead officer leaned forward, placing a thick file on the table. "That's your right, ma'am. Just know that we have statements from multiple passengers and crew members, along with video evidence of the incident." Eliza's jaw tightened as her heart began to race. "Video evidence? That's absurd. Those people are lying. They're all against me." The officer opened the file and slid a series of printed stills from the video across the table. Each one captured her actions, pointing angrily at Anthony, lunging toward him, being restrained by passengers. Her expression in every image was one of unfiltered rage. Eliza's face burned as she stared at the photos. "This doesn't show the whole story," she said, her voice faltering. "He antagonized me. He made me feel unsafe." The second officer, a no-nonsense woman, folded her hands. "From what we've reviewed, you escalated the situation. You'll have a chance to explain yourself in court, but the charges against you are serious." Eliza's indignation flared. "Serious? I'm the victim here. That man, he was sitting there acting smug, looking at me like I was the problem." The female officer raised an eyebrow. "And your response was to attack him?" Eliza stammered, her confidence wavering. I was defending myself. He was." The words trailed off as the room fell silent, the weight of the evidence against her pressing down harder than ever. The officer fixed his gaze on Eliza and spoke with measured authority. "Miss Weller, you are facing charges of assault, disorderly conduct, and interference with a flight crew. Based on the evidence and statements collected, these charges will proceed. You will remain in custody until your arraignment." Eliza shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You can't do this. I'm not a criminal. I was protecting myself." The officers remained calm, their expressions unwavering. The female officer replied evenly, "Your lawyer will have the opportunity to present your case. For now, you'll return to holding." Eliza's protests echoed through the corridor as the officer escorted her back to the cell. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, a reflection of her rising panic. "This is all wrong," she muttered, her voice laced with desperation. "I'll sue every one of you for this." The officer said nothing, leaving her alone once again in the cold silence of the holding cell. Eliza sank onto the bench, her confidence unraveling as the stark reality of her situation pressed down on her. The suffocating weight of her choices felt inescapable. Hours later, Anthony sat across from his lawyer in a quiet, dimly lit office. The weight of the ordeal lingered in the tired lines of his face, but his resolve remained steady. The lawyer, a meticulous man with a calm demeanor, reviewed the evidence methodically. "This isn't just about what happened to you," he said, his voice measured. "It's about holding her accountable. People like her need to understand there are consequences." Anthony nodded slowly, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said quietly, "but I'm not going to let her get away with it." The lawyer leaned back thoughtfully. "With the criminal charges taking precedence, there's no doubt the case will proceed. Once that's settled, we'll move forward with the civil suit. Her actions can't go unchecked." Anthony exhaled deeply, feeling a small measure of relief. For the first time since the incident, he felt the faint stirrings of justice on the horizon. Eliza's arraignment drew a small crowd at the courthouse. A mix of reporters, curious onlookers, and passengers from the flight gathered to witness the unfolding drama. Her name and face had become infamous, plastered across headlines and social media feeds over the past few days. As she was escorted into the courtroom, her face was pale, her expression a volatile mix of anger and fear. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman with an air of precision and authority, wasted no time laying out the charges. "The defendant is charged with assault, disorderly conduct, and interference with the flight crew. Her actions endangered the safety of everyone on board. Eliza sat stiffly beside her attorney, a man whose tired expression suggested he was accustomed to handling combative clients. The room fell silent as the judge entered. Eliza's lawyer stood, preparing to plead not guilty, but the prosecutor preempted him with a commanding tone. "Your Honor, we have multiple corroborating accounts from passengers and crew, as well as clear video evidence of the defendant's behavior. The severity of her actions speaks for itself." The judge flipped through the case file, his expression impassive. Finally, he turned his attention to Eliza. "Miss Weller, do you understand the charges against you?" Eliza abruptly stood, her lawyer's hand barely grazing her arm in an attempt to keep her seated. "Your Honor, this is a complete misunderstanding," she exclaimed. "I was provoked. That man made me feel unsafe, and I was defending myself." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, her tone sharp. "The defendant's claims are directly contradicted by every witness and the video evidence, which clearly shows her initiating the confrontation and escalating it into physical violence." Eliza's face reddened with frustration as she turned to the prosecutor. "You weren't there. You don't know what it was like. He was threatening me with his presence." A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom, some punctuated by audible gasps. The judge rapped his gavel against the bench. "Miss Weller, you will remain silent unless addressed directly." Eliza slumped back into her seat, gripping the edge of the table. Her lawyer leaned in to whisper something, but she waved him off dismissively. The prosecutor continued, her tone unwavering. "Your Honor, given the severity of the charges and the defendant's complete lack of accountability, we recommend she remain in custody or post a substantial bail." Eliza's lawyer attempted to argue for leniency, citing her lack of a prior criminal record, but the judge appeared unimpressed. The judge struck his gavel with a sharp crack. "Bail is set at $225,000, he declared. "The next hearing is scheduled for 2 weeks. The defendant will remain in custody unless bail is posted." Eliza's eyes widened in disbelief as the officers approached her. "No, this isn't fair. I'm not a criminal. You're all against me." Her protests echoed through the courtroom as she was led away, her attorney trailing behind, his face a picture of quiet exasperation. Outside, cameras flashed as reporters furiously jotted down every word of her outburst. The spectacle further cemented her public downfall. At the back of the courtroom, Anthony sat quietly, his expression neutral. He hadn't come for vindication, but to ensure the proceedings were fair and transparent. As Eliza was escorted out, her words lingering in the air, he couldn't help but feel a pang of exhaustion. The cool air in the courthouse hallway offered some relief from the tension inside. As Anthony stepped outside, a journalist approached cautiously, microphone in hand. "Mr. Lake, do you have any comment on today's proceedings?" Anthony hesitated, then shook his head. "No comment," he said softly, walking away without looking back. The courthouse steps were buzzing with activity. Onlookers whispered about the hearing, and reporters scrambled to file their stories. Anthony pushed through the crowd, his shoulders squared but his mind racing. While seeing Eliza face real consequences brought a sense of relief, the weight of the incident was still heavy. As he reached the parking lot, his lawyer caught up to him, her pace brisk but her demeanor calm. "This is just the beginning," she said. "The criminal case will likely wrap up quickly, given the evidence, but our civil suit will take more time." Anthony nodded. "I just want this to send a message," he said firmly. "People like her can't keep getting away with this." The lawyer gave him a reassuring smile. "It already is. The world is watching." Anthony nodded again, his focus shifting to the road ahead. Justice was a slow process, but at least it was moving forward. In the days leading up to the trial, the media frenzy around the case only grew. News outlets dissected every detail of the flight, playing and replaying the viral videos. For Anthony, the time passed in quiet anticipation. He avoided the cameras and the barrage of questions, instead concentrating on preparing for his court appearance. Justice wasn't guaranteed, but he was determined to see it through. Eliza, on the other hand, was unraveling. Her public defenders urged her to cooperate, but her indignation left little room for reason. Every day brought new scrutiny, her name synonymous with disgrace. The courthouse steps were even more crowded when the trial began. Reporters jockeyed for position, eager to capture every moment. Inside, the tension was palpable as the weight of the case pressed down on everyone present. The judge's gavel silenced the murmurs. "We are here today to determine the resolution of the charges against Eliza Weller, including assault, disorderly conduct, and interference with a flight crew. Are both parties ready to proceed?" Anthony's lawyer stood first, her voice steady and authoritative. "Yes, Your Honor." Eliza's attorney rose next, his slight hesitation betraying his unease. "We're ready," the prosecutor began, presenting a detailed account of the events. Witness statements supported her narrative, and the damning video evidence was played for the court. Clips of Eliza's outbursts and her physical attack on Anthony filled the screen. Gasps rippled through the gallery as her actions were laid bare. The prosecutor concluded, her tone resolute. "Your Honor, this is not a case of misunderstanding or provocation. Miss Weller's behavior endangered the safety of everyone on board, and specifically targeted the victim, Mr. Lake, in a manner that was both racially charged and violent. We ask for a guilty verdict on all charges and an appropriate sentence to reflect the severity of her actions." Eliza shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face reddening as the weight of the evidence pressed down on her. Her lawyer stood, attempting to frame her behavior as a momentary lapse in judgment. "Your Honor, my client has no prior criminal record and deeply regrets the events of that day. We ask for leniency in sentencing, as she is already facing significant personal and professional consequences." The judge's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. He paused for a moment before addressing the courtroom. "Does the victim wish to make a statement?" Anthony rose, his movements deliberate and composed. He walked to the front of the courtroom, his presence commanding yet calm. Turning to face the judge, he began to speak. "Your Honor, what happened on that plane wasn't just about me. It was about an attitude, a mindset that people like Miss Weller think they can carry without consequence. She tried to humiliate me, to make me feel small, but in doing so, she showed the world exactly who she is." He paused, letting the words settle. "I hope this court sends a clear message. Actions like hers have consequences, not just for me, but for everyone who has ever had to endure this kind of behavior." With that, Anthony returned to his seat, the room silent, except for the soft scratching of the court reporter's pen. The judge leaned forward, his gaze firm. "Miss Weller, the evidence against you is overwhelming. Your actions on that flight were unacceptable, dangerous, and rooted in prejudice. This court finds you guilty on all charges. Given the seriousness of the offenses, I am sentencing you to 90 days in jail, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management counseling. Additionally, you will be required to pay restitution to the victim for the emotional and physical harm you caused." Eliza gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Your Honor, please, this is too much," she cried. "I've already lost my job, my reputation. I don't deserve this." The judge brought his gavel down sharply. "This court has ruled that your behavior warrants these consequences. Officers, please escort the defendant." As the officers approached, Eliza turned to her lawyer, her voice rising in panic. "Do something. You can't let this happen." Her attorney avoided her gaze, quietly gathering his papers. Without another word, Eliza was led away. Her protests echoed through the courtroom, but quickly faded as the doors closed behind her. Anthony sat silently for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment settle over him. His lawyer leaned toward him, her expression steady. "This is a win, Anthony. Justice was served." He nodded slowly. "It's a step forward," he replied quietly. As he left the courtroom, reporters swarmed him, microphones extended and cameras flashing. He paused briefly, meeting their questions with calm resolve. "I have no comment," he said. "Let the verdict speak for itself." The cool air outside the courthouse greeted him as he stepped onto the stairs. Anthony felt a weight lift, though the burden of the experience lingered. It wasn't a complete victory, not in the larger sense, but for today, it was enough. Standing on the courthouse steps, Anthony watched as reporters scattered and onlookers murmured among themselves. The noise faded into the background, and his thoughts drifted back to the plane. He recalled the way Eliza had looked at him, the way she had spoken to him as though his existence held less value. It wasn't the first time he had faced such blatant prejudice, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Anthony exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the crisp air. People like Eliza weren't rare. While she was being held accountable this time, so many others went unchallenged. The weight of knowing how deeply entrenched that kind of hatred was in society pressed on him. It wasn't just about Eliza's hateful words. It was about the countless moments of quiet bias, of unspoken judgments, of being made to feel like less. He clenched his fists briefly before relaxing them. As he did, he reminded himself of the support he had received from the passengers, the flight crew, and even strangers after the video went viral. Eliza's actions had been an attempt to strip him of dignity, but the outcome had been different. He had stood firm. For that, he allowed himself a small measure of pride. Small steps, he murmured to himself as he descended the courthouse stairs. Small steps toward a world where people like her can't so easily weaponize their prejudice. For now, it was enough. Anthony tucked his hands into his pockets and walked away, his head held high.